Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Simon Dalby on climate geopolitics. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. I am David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and also Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week I'm very happy to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation a noted expert on some aspect of international public policy or global governance. And today I'm pleased to welcome my new colleague, Simon Dalby, who's the CIGI Chair in Political Economy of Climate Change and also a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. So welcome, Simon, and welcome to the Balsillie School.
Thank you very much.
Climate geopolitics.
Yep.
It's a very ambitious topic, and so I'd like to find out more about how a geopolitics lens helps us understand the problem of climate change and our inability to manage it, or potential ability to manage it. But we'll start with a little bit of a catch-up for those who may not be familiar with what happened recently in Doha, where we stand on climate change governance, and exactly where do you think we go from here?
Well, each year, governments and large groups of NGOs and related policymakers get together for what's called a conference of the parties. Actually there's a number of conferences put together, but they basically are the annual discussion of how to govern climate change, what needs to be done, how to move ahead in tackling the issues. In Doha, we have moved ahead a little more, as we do in each of these conferences, pushing the agenda out to 2015 in terms of what we're now calling a gateway, which is a series of institutional arrangements which hopefully will lead to the negotiation of a comprehensive treaty by the end of 2015, which is supposed to take effect in 2020. The idea being that we will then have some kind of arrangement where everybody can do what is necessary to tackle the climate change issue. Clearly, a few steps in the right direction have been taken in Doha, but what is particularly worrisome for those of us who watch climate change is that we are moving terribly slowly. The new gateway is supposed to facilitate negotiations which are supposed to get us a treaty in 2015, which is supposed to kick in 5 years later, whereas at the moment the science is telling us that this is too slow. We need to move much more quickly, is what the scientists are saying, because despite 20 years of discussions at the various COP conferences, following on from the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed in the early 90s, nonetheless, the emissions of greenhouse gases, and particularly the big one, the carbon dioxide one, that's the major focus, the trajectory is inexorably upwards, and indeed emissions rates are increasing, not decreasing around the world. So we are reaching a point where really we are starting to think in crisis terms, because the urgency that is clear from the science is not reflected in the diplomatic arrangements. Doha has moved the process ahead, but not anything like fast enough to really get a grip on the carbon dioxide emissions in particular. Yes, the other ones, the methanes and the various other chemicals matter too. The reason, of course, that we need to move fairly quickly on this is that once carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, it hangs around for a long time. We're talking centuries, or at least a century, and that all depends on how it is absorbed, and clearly we're not absorbing enough on land, we're not absorbing anything like enough in the oceans to mean that we can ratchet greenhouse gases back down quickly enough. Hence the crisis, the major concern that Doha isn't moving us ahead fast enough. So now we are faced with a situation where, while the politicians are beginning to say the right things, they are beginning to talk about some kind of arrangements that will deal with increased aid, or at least aid, to poorer countries that have to adapt as climate change accelerates. We are beginning to get recognition that damage is being done as a consequence of climate change. Hence, some kind of mechanisms need to be in place to deal with this. Under the rubric, principally now it seems, of adaptation, facilitating societies making the changes to adapt to a changing climate. What's really scary, and what's really got the scientists alarmed, is the fact that adaptations all very well if climate is changing relatively slowly. But the nightmare scenario now is that climate will change quickly. We're talking in terms of years or maybe decades, not over periods of centuries, in which case it's much, much more difficult to adapt our societies to deal with what is coming. The great difficulty with the science now, of course, is while we know that changes are afoot, how they are going to play out is far from clear. The scientists are paying a lot of attention to these issues, but there is so much to look at. It's so complicated, and things work so differently in different places depending on the geography of where changes kick in, that making precise predictions about who needs to do what where is very tricky. So now we are presented with a policy situation that is big, it's very complicated, there's an awful lot of players, and we've got some hard thinking to do in the next little while about how to deal with an issue that is that big, that serious, and beginning to kick in right now.
Well, we have a lot to talk about. Obviously, we'll be back in a minute with Simon Dalby. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So Simon, a cynic might say, look, we've had one treaty on climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, and people bent over backwards to say that that was a major accomplishment, and the record was pretty much across the board. States failed to live up to their obligations and failed to take meaningful steps to make up for the lost ground that failure to meet the Kyoto targets indicated. And then ever since, there's this pattern of states get together in these big conferences here and there, and they talk, they water things down, they come up with some pablum that they can then claim as some sort of progress or achievement, and nothing, in fact, actually happens. So the question is, why are we pursuing this track? Why are we still looking to states in these large multilateral forums to solve the climate change problem for us? Why aren't we looking elsewhere?
I think it's probably in part a massive failure of imagination. States are how we have always assumed that governance is done. We have always assumed that they are the ultimate authorities responsible for our collective fates. Therefore, in the face of these circumstances, you look to states to solve the solution, or to provide the solution, solve the problem. What we are now facing is a crisis of governance insofar as, for all the reasons you've just outlined, it's quite clear that states have not dealt effectively with this situation. Hopefully, the optimists will say they haven't dealt with it yet. The cynics will say we are all doomed, let's party and it's over and enjoy the few years of relatively stable climate left, because after that it's all apocalyptic disaster.
So what were the genuinely hopeful signs at Doha?
The genuinely hopeful signs at Doha were that finally people are recognizing we do need to actually get serious about negotiating some kind of a treaty. Whether we can negotiate a treaty that's going to solve the problem is another question altogether. But nonetheless, it is still in international politics better to keep talking than to start thinking about looking to protecting your own backyard without talking. The classic security dilemmas have been avoided. People are not just looking to their own short-term interests. Yes, they are looking to those, but not. They have recognized that there is at least some common dimensions to this that unilateral solutions will not work to. And at least as long as the process continues, well, there's some hope for optimism there. Most of us are not optimistic that those big conferences are going to solve the problem. And indeed, it's quite clear that other parts of society, corporations are starting to think about, well, how do we actually green our own operations? Lots of organizations in everything from school boards to city planners are looking at the local level and thinking, well, wait a minute. Actually, we need to think seriously about how we make our institutions more resilient. We need to think seriously about how we build schools that, well, why don't we actually put the solar panels on the roof and not worry about fossil fuels heating them or cooling them? Why don't we think about how it is that we build buildings that got a bit stronger roofs, so when the more severe storms come along, the roofs actually stay on, because in a crisis, keeping a roof on is a really good thing. In many parts of society, we're starting to think about how to do those things differently. Automobile manufacturers did cut a deal with the Obama administration recently, where they are going to substantially increase the fuel efficiency rates. It's come a generation too late, because in fact this was already started in the 1970s and then rolled back in the 1980s. But we're trying again. Admittedly, a generation has been lost on that particular score, because automobile manufacturers don't necessarily have to have gasoline-powered engines under the hood. If you are thinking seriously about infrastructure provision as a government or as a city, well, you are thinking about what kind of rapid transit, bike lanes perhaps, as part of a city planning, not in Toronto perhaps, but in many other cities. This is being taken seriously. Even in my native Ireland, they have decided that the fiscal crisis that they are facing needs to be addressed, and they have started a series of, being Irish of course it's very funny, green taxes. The New York Times had it the other day, back in, when was it, the end of beginning of January of 2013. They were actually running a story that simply
fascinating story,
mentioned that Ireland is now being greener. They are had to bite the bullet on taxes, and they decided to do something new. They decided to charge for garbage pickup. They decided to put serious amounts of tax on gas-guzzling automobiles, and people's behavior is changing quite noticeably. So there are all sorts of ways that changes can be made. But initiatives are increasingly coming from the grassroots. They are coming from cities, they are coming from corporations, not necessarily from governments. And in some cases, governments are going to have to play catch up on some of these things.
Now, in my field, a common view is that if you really want to solve a problem, you have to reframe it. You have to call it a security issue, securitization of an issue. All of a sudden, you get the resources, the attention. Is this feasible in climate change? Can it be reframed as a security issue in a way that will galvanize genuine action? In
the Pentagon's case, at least some parts of the Pentagon, they seem to think that this is in fact a crucial issue that needs to be addressed. Back when the big environmental security discussion started in the late 1980s as the Cold War wound down, Daniel Dooney penned what's probably the most famous paper in the whole debate, in which he warned that the military is not a good institutional fit for environmental difficulties. They're designed to kill people and break things. They're not designed to install solar panels. They're not designed to do forestry projects. Although you might argue that, in fact, in some cases, particularly the American military, the Corps of Engineers, in fact, does do major environmental kind of things with dams and irrigation systems and so on.
Right.
So in some cases, the military is the appropriate way to do this. The real thing that Dan pointed to, I think, that was more important was, in fact, that this is a common problem. It is not something for which there are unilateral national security solutions. Nonetheless, you can mobilize populations, or governments at least, around issues of national security. And indeed, the British have done this for the last 5, 6, 7 years, thinking seriously about national interests, what are the priorities, looking at water supply issues, looking at rising sea levels, and the floods in the last couple of years in Britain in particular have got a lot of people's attention, because clearly the infrastructure is not in place. Clearly this is a matter that is a top priority. It's not something you can use tanks and aircraft carriers, never mind Trident missiles, to deal with, however. But what is interesting is that in some states the military has taken the lead in raising the alarm. The military has paid attention to this. Clearly the Pentagon in the United States is seriously worried, not only because some of its port facilities are going to be inundated and some of its hangars will no doubt get blown away when hurricanes hit their wide-ranging bases across the world. But clearly also they are recognizing that humanitarian disasters and potential political instabilities caused by rapid climate change are things that they may be called upon to deal with. They're also realizing that as a major institutional user of fossil fuels, innovating in terms of the energy sources they use matters greatly. Why don't you put solar panels on those hangars? And indeed, they have done some serious logistical analysis of what caused casualties in Iraq, what is still causing casualties and vulnerabilities for their troops in Afghanistan, and realize that the logistical supply chains bringing huge quantities of fuel to remote outposts makes the supply chains very vulnerable. They are losing lots of casualties because they're the obvious targets for local insurgents who don't like the presence of American troops on their soil. They're easy, vulnerable targets for IEDs and other forms of military action. So if you actually don't have a military that's hugely dependent on fossil fuels, you actually solve a lot of your logistical problems too. If you can actually innovate rapidly with technological change, that's bound to spill over into other sectors of the economy too. So ramping up solar production to supply the military facilities drops the price. As we get better at making solar panels, they become cheaper. And so in fact, technological innovation driven by the military in some parts of this climate change puzzle might actually be helpful. And indeed, there are international networks of retired generals and related to the Institute for Environmental Security that are actually advocating precisely changing the military. It's a hard sell with the older generation who in particularly grew up with big toys, big fuel tanks. Thinking about smart solar-powered combat units is something that the new generation gets. And indeed, what's very interesting talking to the American military is the captains and the lieutenants and some of the majors get it, the generals don't yet. At least that's what I've been told. So there's a cultural change here that runs right through institutions in ways that is rather different from traditional security issues. But
cultural
the other thing,
cultural
change is big, it's happening. But what's also very clear is the recognition that if climate is a security issue, it's not a national security issue, although it will have national impacts.
Not only a national security issue.
It will have all sorts of international security, not least because climate is a global phenomena. It works out in different ways in different places. Humanitarian disaster relief operations are now nearly universally a matter of international cooperation. It makes a huge difference if when a storm is heading towards one country, those majors and captains that are running the helicopter units get in touch with each other across national frontiers and say, look, we think we've got a big storm coming this way. Can you be ready to give us some airlift capacity because we're probably going to need it? If the militaries are ready to do that kind of response, it's very different from, oh, the migrants are coming, close the borders, prepare to shoot the scary foreigners that are coming to our soil.
Right.
How we pose security now matters greatly, and there are international and national dimensions to this. Thinking through the appropriate response in particular circumstances is part of what IR now needs to do as a scholarly contribution.
Very clearly a major human security issue as well as any potential national.
Very much so.
We'll be back in a minute once again with Simon Dalby. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So geopolitics is a frame that you bring to this set of issues that I think most people don't tend to bring to it. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about why you do that, how you understand geopolitics, and how you understand it as something that adds value to our understanding of climate change governance.
Geographical notions run all through our political discussions. They're usually so taken for granted we don't pay much attention to them. What geographers have been doing for, well, a couple of decades now has been stopping and thinking much more carefully about the implicit assumptions of geography that structure political discussions. It's obvious we live in a world of nation states, although when you actually look at states, they are such a diverse group of things that you really lumping them all together as the same entity stretches a category. What have Tuvalu, China, Bolivia, and Luxembourg got in common? Well, they're members of the United Nations, perhaps, but beyond that, these are entities that are so different that simply lumping them all together is something that doesn't necessarily lead to clear thinking, particularly in the notions of things like climate change. We need to stop and think about the geography of this much more carefully. Mostly the geography of security is about us in here protected from bad things out there. There's an implicit geography to all of this which can be helpful and is sometimes extremely misleading when it comes to the politics of things like climate change. What I've been trying to do over the last few years is say, okay, let's start at the other end. Let's start with what climate change scientists are telling us about the geography of climate change. Set aside states for a while. Look at the geography, look at who's suffering where, look at what is causing the changes and where that is, and how we can think about that in a framework that takes the environmental dimensions of this to begin with. Unfortunately, a lot of the science stops there. It doesn't connect to the politics. What I'm trying to do is find ways of bridging the gap between what is now called Earth system science and the policy frameworks, which usually rely on those implicit geographies of nation states. If you look at strange things like geological publications these days, you will find a debate going on about whether we are in fact living in a new geological era, or should that be an epoch? Technically, I think it should be an epoch. Not the kind of thing social scientists ever pay much attention to. But the reason why this is significant is that the Earth system science people are suggesting that it's not just climate change, but all the other changes that humanity, or industrial humanity, global capitalism if you prefer, has caused in the biosphere, have changed things so fundamentally that we are actually now living in new geological circumstances, what are now simply called the Anthropocene, literally the geological epoch in which the new driving force is anthro, that's humanity. We now live in the Anthropocene, according to many of these geological scientists. It's not
what are the things other than
official.
climate change that?
Well, we have become, we are acidifying the oceans quite dramatically.
As a result of carbon
As
dioxide.
a result of carbon dioxide. But that's a major environmental change that isn't actually directly climate change, although warming the oceans is what we are effectively doing as well. We are fixing nitrogen. We are taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere in terms of artificial fertilizers at a rate that is much larger now than what natural processes do. So we have done the same thing with phosphorus. We have been messing around with the ozone layer too, and that issue is partly solved, although not completely resolved yet. We have changed quite dramatically land use. Much of the fertile land on the planet is now agricultural, not wild, natural lands. We have dammed most of the major rivers on the planet. We've replumbed much of the terrestrial hydrology. Again, this has caused dramatic changes, largely related to urbanization and to agriculture. But we are living in an increasingly artificial world, one that is now simply called the Anthropocene. You can push it a little further and argue that all of these cities, the huge, great big concrete forms we build in buildings, bridges, docks, roads, are sort of a new form of geological strata. They're a new form of rock, effectively.
But this is a world that we've created, but it's a world that we like. We're comfortable with it.
We are comfortable with it.
So how does that? How does this frame incent us to start changing behavior?
What it should incentivize, can I use that awful word? Sure. Get us to do is start thinking much more seriously about what kind of world we are quite literally making.
Right.
Can we make one that will continue to function as we like it? That's, of course, the really big question for climate change. What is interesting, if you think in geological terms, of course, is how do we face not the crisis that will lead to the end times, to disaster, but how do we build a world for the next times? How do we build a future that can actually function within the parameters of a fairly stable climatological system, and one where we can actually ensure that in the very long term we have the phosphorus and the nitrogen and we have the fuels that will allow us to continue to feed 7, or is that 8, or is it going to be 9 billion human beings living on in a system which is now increasingly artificial, increasingly urban. That's the real challenge. Thinking about this in terms of how it is we, quite literally what we make as a production problem, is a very different way of framing climate change from, oh, the environment is going to get us. It requires this dramatic shift in our thinking. We now have to think about what we are making, what we are building, and how we are organizing our societies to make and build the things we need for the future.
Very good. We'll be back one more time with Simon Dalby. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So Simon, as we broke there, you were hinting at the concept of sustainability, but without using the word. So let's talk about sustainability. What do we have to do, in your view, in order to achieve a sustainable Anthropocene, assuming that it will continue to be an Anthropocene of some kind?
It will for the foreseeable future, because we have changed the parameters of the global system so fundamentally that we have effectively taken our fate into our own hands, or at least the rich industrial fossil fuel burning part of humanity has taken humanity's fate into its own hands. If we're thinking about building, if we're thinking about producing, what we are quite literally making, we need to think about climate change in terms of very practical things like buildings that don't have heating and cooling units because we build them so that they don't need those kinds of energy inputs. And indeed, the German building codes have been revised. They're actually trying to think seriously about how to build what is called a passive house, quite literally a house that doesn't have a furnace, doesn't have a heating unit. Canadians are a long way from thinking about building architectural things that don't need heating and cooling units. But we can do that kind of stuff now, but it requires us to think very differently about architecture. It requires us thinking very differently about our transportation systems too. Do we really need V8 engines in our SUVs to take the kids to the daycare? No, we don't actually, but we're going to have to think very much more carefully about how we build transportation systems too. We are going to have to deal with our addiction to jet fuel, and that's very difficult because jets are so flexible, they're so easy to get around with now, we take them for granted. But we are going to have to think long and hard about the modes of transport that we use, how it is that we decide to move information perhaps rather than people. And academics are going to think about this too. We travel a lot. Can we travel less? Can we use podcasts? Can we use electronic communications to substitute for quite a lot of what we have done? All of these kinds of things need to be thought through. They need to be thought through fairly quickly. But one of the things that is very clear over the last couple of decades is that technological innovation can move fairly quickly. It's difficult to change energy systems in anything less than generational terms, but nonetheless we can move quickly on this. The average fuel inefficient car that is built today isn't going to be around probably much more than 15 years because we recycle vehicles. If it is replaced by a very efficient vehicle 15 years down the road, then we can cut emissions from the transportation sector fairly quickly.
Can we trust states to do this?
I'm not sure we can trust states to do this.
Who else
we certainly
look
can't
to?
trust states if they continue to approach international bargaining sessions as international bargaining sessions. If they can begin to understand that this is a collective problem that they have to act cooperatively together on and start to figure out how to move forward most quickly rather than understand moving forward as things that entail costs, which has been much of the international negotiation system for the last 2 decades, then states can be very helpful and move quickly. But until we can recognize we're not in a competitive bargaining situation, we're in a collective problem which requires cooperation to solve rather than constantly bickering about who's going to move first and who's going to cut which emissions more quickly because supposedly that puts us at an economic disadvantage, etc., etc. We have got to get out of that mode of thinking. And one of the major problems for international relations over the next decade is precisely how to begin to facilitate new modes of thinking amongst international leadership. And that's one of our major concerns. It relates to policy innovation, it relates to governance, all of the things that the Balsillie School and CIGI are focused on. This is an agenda for social scientists too. But it does mean that security resides in places like building codes. It resides in places that states have not normally thought about in terms of the implications of what kind of vehicles we make, what kind of decisions we make about where to locate schools. Do we need school buses if we put schools in different places? If we are going to densify our urban settlements, we may actually be able to change how it is we understand recreational spaces, how it is that kids play, how it is that people actually use cities for recreational purposes, all of those kinds of facets of our lives. Can we change what is deemed valuable from having bigger and more to actually doing things much more efficiently, to using smart technologies rather than big fuel consumption as the kind of way that we live our lives? All of those issues are up for grabs. All of those issues matter. They're all things that social scientists will be paying a lot of attention to over the next decade or two. And we need to get on with it fairly quickly.
Does it require a massive transfer of wealth from rich countries to poor countries?
In some cases, I think it may, and that is one of the major sticking points, simply because some of the technological innovations in the South, we can't wait around for conventional development to trickle down. But on the other hand, there are technologies like, for instance, cell phones, which are changing how it is that development works dramatically. And relatively speaking, cell phones use very little energy and very little resources. Clearly, we are going to have to find ways to facilitate jumping over, as it were, some of the fossil fuel powered technologies that modern societies have used, so that we get development going straight to solar powered infrastructure, going straight to things like solar power, cell phones. I mean, why can't we simply leave our cell phone face down when we're not using it and have
the way we do a watch,
and have the solar power simply recharge it
right.
on the back? I mean, this kind of thinking we can do quickly once people are focused on it. And of course, part of the task for social scientists for the next few years is to try to get people to focus on thinking how they can make practical changes quickly that will improve the efficiencies of our economies, and do so quickly enough so that we're not leaving huge residues of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that will cause massive changes to how the Earth system operates.
Well, it's hard to imagine a bigger or more important problem, but it's nice to see that people are thinking big about it and thinking outside the box about it. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing your thoughts and your perspectives on it. And thank you to the audience for joining us again on Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us next week on cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.